All right, Professor Redmond, I was going to start with two of your Miles Davis poems. So Milestone and then Milestone. So I was just wondering, could I get you to read Milestone first, and then we'll,
Sure.
or maybe we'll just read both of them and then we'll talk about it.
Okay. So I'm reading from Songs of an Afrophone, my third book of poetry, and it came out in 1972. Excuse me. Miles Song for Miles Davis. Gold-lipped blunderbuss, diamond-eyed derringer, cool air carver and fashion freak, moon song and moon sun, moon songster and lunar lyricist for a night-faced nation, croon bearer shuttling a blue chord, Polly screaming his hex songs, refingering a three-keyed note friar, blowing sound beams and phonic rainbows, hissing, sighing, humming through the sun, root tooting and root toting, a totem of tones and tidal walls, miles from home, miles to roam, Clifford Brown reincarnated and the subconscious chorus of this gold-lipped wind fencer, Clifford. Yard song, foot and inch song, miles from home, miles, multitudes, whole storms crushed to sound graphs, fed through an afrophone, dark song in copper moon, miles to roam, miles to moan, cotton-lipped flute, note sizzler, brass blare and brass bone, riffin', 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 blood balling up to ash stream, up to afro urn, condensing to acoustigraphs, steady, yet startling as fixed stairs, echoes caught in stone pots. And for the next one, written after Miles passed, excuse me, appears in volume 11 of Drum Voices Review. And this is actually the prologue to a long piece that I read at Miles's memorial at his and my alma mater, Lincoln High School in East St. Louis. Milestone, the birth of an ancestor. For Miles Dewey Davis III, 1926 to 1991, in memoriam, in futurium. Prologue. Dressed up in pain, the flatted fifth began its funereal climb up the tribal stairwell. Grief radiant as it buzzed and gleamed with moans, spread like laughter or Ethiopia's wings, mourned its own percussive rise, became blues born in the hoarse East St. Louis air, bore witness to the roaring calm, the garrulous silence, the caskets of tears, the gushing stillness, The death of the cool became the birth of an ancestor. Yeah, y'all. The death of the cool became the birth of an ancestor.
All right, appreciate it. Can you say the circumstances under which the first one, Milestone, was written? And you said 1972, right?
Right. It was written between in the early 70s. This was the second book of mine, the other being In a Time of Rain and Desire, to be written as a cohesive volume. You know, in other words, thematically, the poems were were designed for a book, or for a one reading, one sitting, one setting, one one work, a ballet, an operetta, what Amiri Baraka might call a bop opera, the book for a musical piece, for what might be composed. You know? So that was the case for both of the books, for Songs from an Afrophone and the excuse me, In a Time of Rain and Desire, love poems.
What could you? Oh, no, I was gonna say, could you say something about your approach in the? Because I've heard you say, and I've seen you write on some of my things. You'll say lift the language, and it seems like that's what you were doing already at that moment. So could you say something about your approach to it? I love like these lines, like lunar lyricist, and then brass blader. So yeah, could you say a little bit about your approach to?
Yes, it was. It's consistent and yet different with and from the other pieces. You notice that almost every piece in there has the word something related to music in the title, and the title of the book itself, Songs from an Afrophone. That I borrowed Afrophone, although I've seen the word spelled in different ways. APHRO, it's an African instrument, but I've seen it spelled without Afro as in Africa, more like Aphrodite, you know. So I decided to use Afro as in the Afro, as in Afro-American studies, and use the slash instead of the hyphen that was often used. So my approach was to make something fluid if I could. That is, one poem segueing fairly easily into the next poem. And many of them are for musicians and singers, like the next one here is for Sam and Dave, and the poems for the Miracles, and for Curtis Mayfield and people like that. There's even one for Julius Hempfield in this book. So the overarching concept and the arc that I was trying to draw or follow concerning music as the root experience, as the basic experience of African Americans, of actually human beings. There were people that I studied with, like the great philosopher, whose name escapes me, but it'll come back to me, an African philosopher who was chief in Nigeria, but he also had a PhD. Came to this country, and he was one of the people I had an opportunity to study with. He was at Kent, and he was at the University of Pittsburgh. As I said, I will give you his name. He had the little book from the center to the circumference, and from the circumference to the center. And he was a philosopher and a composer. At any rate, one of his important assertions for me was that if you had to select one word that would summarize black people, and you'd be crazy, of course, to pick one word to summarize any people, it would be belief. There'd be two words, belief and music. And I think it was music and belief in that order. You know, if you just want to say, okay, what is blackness? How would you describe or summarize black people? You'd say music and belief, faith. So this book derives in part, and this poem itself certainly specifically derives from that idea, as the interaction of all elements with music at the core. Yeah. and it's I was talking last night at Duff's Restaurant during the award ceremony about having to design the new curricula. And, you know, black studies, ethnic studies, women's studies, gay and lesbian studies, anti-war studies, free speech studies, urban studies, poverty. You know, that was part of my generation, what my generation was about. And the idea of the studies created quite a series of exchanges and investigations, and they continue. And one of the things we based what we were doing on was ancient thought. You know, any ancient thought that we could use, in particular ancient thought as it was handed down from the African civilizations, you know, whether it was the question of the star Sirius and the Dogon people, or the 7 principles on which the knowledge that came to us from Egyptology was built, and so on. And we kept coming back to this idea of the interrelationship of elements in the heavens, and that moon songster here, the lunar lyricist. I heard Elijah Muhammad speak, and one of the things he said early on in my career, I was a young man, he said, if you're having some difficulty with your woman, take her near the river, because the water calms women because of women's makeup and the flow. And then we looked into things like the gravitational pull of the moon on the earth affects the tides of the ocean and the cycles of women. And we actually were able to go into that. So this whole, and our moods. So this moon songster and lunar lyricist, I was really trying to get some of the depth of black studies, of Afrocentricity, of the great thinkers in various cultures, you know, across the world, trying to collapse some of that into my poems, so that anybody who was really studying the culture, they'd go in and said, oh yeah, he's talking about the Dogon, without even saying it, you know. He's talking about the creators of the pyramids. and those are some things that that Miles looked into. And I knew that. I knew that Leon Thomas, another homeboy of mine, had lectures on, he had the yodel, the pygmy yodel, right? In a lot of his recordings, you know, with Pharaoh Sanders and others, right? And he knew, he had lectures about the historic relationship between the Nile and the Mississippi. In fact, Ndizaki Shangai, who used to be Paulette Williams when she was here living in St. Louis, has it in Colored Girls, in her play, Colored Girls, that phenomenon. So that's kind of where this comes from. Looking at him, Miles, who was a dresser, who was a boxer, a dancer, you know, all the kinds of things, and then his pioneering nature as a musician. That's what sort of backdrops all this, you know. The idea of him moving about, Miles, playing on Miles, the name, and distance, and that sort of thing.
That's something.
That's what does that make sense?
Yeah. That's very helpful. I was wondering too when you were mentioning these the poems though, because like we could say that it's as much, if not more, music today than 20 years ago, right? But I see less poets write about, like, I mean, it's not as prominent. Like you could do this whole book on music, and everybody had a Coltrane poem.
That's right.
You know, black arts folks. I mean, they had a Malcolm, but they had the Coltrane out. What do you think drew that to, like, made the music? I guess you kind of explained, but that's just very interesting now that we might seem to have less prominent music. I mean, poetry about music in that way.
Yeah.
You know, it seems like it might have been a different time. I'm not sure.
Yeah. And the role of the musician and music was different. You know, why we looked at Jackie Wilson and the way he dressed, James Brown and his silk. We looked at Billy Eckstine and the Mr. B shirt. Everybody wanted a Mr. B shirt. The women liked the flower in Billie Holiday's hair, you know, and you know, people wanted to look like some of the folks that they, but it wasn't the same. There was a deeper connection to the music and survival, or as a survival tool, which I think I'm talking to young people about it. We had a program Saturday where a bunch of us men who have modicums of success sat at tables with black boys. They were 9 to 16. So each one of us, or two of us, sat with these boys, and I was asking them, because I'm interested in them, asking them. Everybody said, well, what do you listen to? They said rap. Everybody said rap, right? And a big program that Dells do every year. So I'm trying to find out, you know, the root, basic connection that they're making with the music, and if it has anything to do. Now, I know some of it does because the words are more direct, and the chop, you know, I mean, you know, you can't miss that. But I think that we connected it with the evolution of the fight for freedom, even when it was like the, you know, the moon glows or one of the groups that just blended harmony without any real statement, sang from the Great American Songbook, you know. You know, the preceded R&B, the crooners, you know. We still connected it with the evolution of our struggle. So because I think that historical discontinuity, which is how Henry Clark described it, is what we see now. You know, the discontinuity. I think that's why in the minds of the young people listening to music today, it's not directly associated with the black struggle or black beauty, you know, or black aesthetics at all, you know, black art. You know, it's what we saw in Joe Louis, what we saw in Ali, and what they see or saw in, say, the dancer rappers. My daughter was with him, you know.
Oh, MC Hammer.
MC Hammer. I don't think it's the same stream. That's a cause for investigation.
So almost, maybe 20 years later is when you wrote Milestone.
Yeah.
What were the circumstances?
I was responding to a very much alive Miles, you know, who, Miles was born in 1926. So when I wrote this poem, he would have been, 40-ish. 50, I'm sorry. 50, 50 something.
46
something. And then, of course, the second poem was written on the occasion of his passing. And to be read at his memorial at Lincoln High School, you know. So I was thinking about it. There's a longer portion that has quite a bit of his own history. That's the prologue here fronts a biographical section that's about 4 or 5 times the length of this piece, and so it was like a call to the ancestors. You know, actually, this poem actually describes what I felt as I heard. I was hearing accounts of his death. So that's the circumstances. Placing him back in East St. Louis, he belonged to the world here, except that in the first poem, except I talked about home, miles to roam, he's out. Then by the time I get to this poem, I interacted with his family over a number of decades, going to the house. His daughter at the time was teaching math at Miles Davis Elementary School. So it was, I guess I instinctively placed him in the city. Horace E. St. Louis air, sort of a way of saying the blues, just where the blues comes from. Because when on the road I say, growing up in East St. Louis, whenever you inhale or exhale, you took in and let out the blues. You had no choice. That's the way I describe it. You had no choice. So that's why I say the Horace E. St. Louis air, even the air, and I did that unconsciously, although I've been saying over time that if you breathe in East St. Louis, you take in and let out the blues, right? And then there was a saying that I used as an epigraph to another poem called Double Clutch Lover that we used to use as kids, not really knowing what we were saying. Let me blues you before I lose you, baby. Let me blues you before I lose you. And it was kind of a mannish way of talking to girls and women, yeah.
Did you know you were going to be reading this at a memorial when you wrote it?
I didn't know it. I wrote it, and this is the only part that's been published. I wrote it, and then I went to the memorial, and I said to them, I have this poem, because I'm not listed on the program. But Dr. Lillian Parks, the first black woman superintendent of East St. Louis Public Schools, said she and the undertaker, Bernadette Officer, who was the brother, she's the brother who was the mayor, said, yeah, oh yeah, we definitely would, you know. And I read the whole piece there.
Oh, really?
And I had about 25 or 30 requests for it. I told people I'd get it out. I never got back to the work of editing and revising the body of the poem. So this ended up first in another issue of Drum Voices, and then reprinted here in the anthology.
So you so I'm just clear.
I
So
sort
you
of went there and bogarted.
so you showed up with your poem?
With my bogart my way up to the program. In fact, some people saw the program and they were saying, "How did you get on the program?" Because, you know, it was like an official Miles Davis Enterprises product. It had one of his art pieces on it, and it had him, a photo of him being knighted in Spain. Sir Miles, right? So, I mean, this was a classy program. I have a copy of it. Very classy, right? And
it was in East St. Louis, right?
Yeah.
Where was it in East St.
At
Louis?
Lincoln High School.
Okay.
And Oliver Lake came, and he worked with with a student, Russell Gunn, and, you know, all the kids. They're well-known professional musicians now, but they were students under Ron Carter, not the bassist, but our Ron Carter.
Yeah.
So it was all done. This was all done out of New York, you know, and, you know, put together. It was fancy, you know, and the representatives from New York, from the law office, and, you know, Sony, and, you know, different the recording companies. So they were here. So I bogarted my way onto the program.
And that was 91 when they...
yeah. He died the 28th of August, and the program was the 9th of September. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, he died the 28th of September, and the program was October the 9th. Yeah. But people were just saying, "How did you get on the program?"
Now, when you read it, like I've heard folks, musicians, when they perform with you, you have them play parts of all blues.
Exactly.
When did you start? When did you add all blues to performances of it?
That was sometime later. I didn't do it that day. If I recall, now there's a tape of it. I recall I didn't do it that day, but not long after that I started it. I remember doing it in at Langston Hughes Centennial, and excuse me, Baraka was in the audience, and he started tapping on his on the desk, you know, when I was reading it. Yeah.
What made you choose that song to add?
Well, because, you know, it seemed to be the pivotal piece for him, you know. This one and So What. I mean, they remind me of East St. Louis. You know, So What is like East St. Louis philosophy. I explained to these boys what it means. And we got up to get in line, and I asked them, did they know? They knew it was Miles, which I was very pleased. These kids, right? They knew it was Miles Davis. Of course, one of them is a friend of mine. He knows more about jazz than I know, you know. And then, but they all knew it was Miles Davis. Didn't know the song. And then I told them, okay, well, I'm going to put some fat on your head. As my uncle used to say, put some fat on your head. Boys, I said, those two titles and Miles' way in the world are connected to East St. Louis, the philosophy that comes out of East St. Louis. Yeah. It's like, so what? I used to hear it, you know, members of my team, and I would say it to the opposing team on the football field. So what, you know? We yell, yeah. So, and then all blues, you know, the foundation of who we are. One writer called us blues people, I told him, you know. So we went on with that. They were fascinated. They wanted, man. When I connected it to the word philosophy, I mean, they were, because they were sure they all part in mentoring programs anyway. So they, you know, they were very, very interested in that. So that's why I chose all blues, because it just seemed to me that at the basis of what he was about and what the people are about is that blues and blues motif. So and I didn't really think it hit me, man. Just the lines unfolding. When I did Flat, when I read that to music audience that know music, man, wow, they're like, they get in a poem, you know, just. And my nephew, who was a music teacher, said to me, "You can't flat the fifth, Uncle." I said, "Get your horn out and try it." He told me that. This guy was a master in music. Well, he didn't have a master. He told me that. And I said, you just made a gotcha statement. And he said, "Wait a minute, we on the phone." He picked up his horn. He said, "Yes, you can." Because people are thinking of seventh or, you know. He said, "Well, yeah, Uncle, but a fifth can be flatted. Try it." I just told him to try it. He asked him when he got his horn. Now, I don't know music, but I knew that. Blew him out, man. Blew Delano out. For the next few times I saw him, he was ducking. He just said, what did they have for me now? I'm the music teacher, right? Anyway, I wanted music. I wanted the poem to be musical, without music, you know, but with music if someone wanted it there, or, you know, if the occasion called for it. And that was, yeah.
I was gonna next switch to this one. Funky Grace.
Yeah.
Is another one. Yeah, I asked her to add this one because I said, let's make sure we get one that I've seen when you do performances. This is always one of your rotation.
Yeah.
One of your, I guess, standards.
Yeah.
Or signature pieces. So so I have you read it.
Funky Grace from the Hero series, which I never completed it, even though this poem was written, you know, way back, you know, in the 80s, for Joseph B. Harrison. He took the lion lunge, hey, hey. He took the tiger step, hey, hey. He took the tomb trail, hey, hey. He took the sacred plunge, hey, hey. He made the ocean leap, hey, hey. He made the gong gong call, hey, hey. He made the death mouth, hey, hey. He made the freedom creep, hey, hey. He ate the juicy blues, hey, hey. He ate the rat roach flat, hey, hey. He ate the numb stare, hey, hey. He ate the airborne shoe, hey, hey. He caught the sassy space, hey, hey. He caught the totem call, hey, hey. He caught the kill flame, hey, hey. He caught the funky grace, hey, hey. He caught the funky grace, hey, hey. He caught that funky grace, hey, hey. Give me some funky grace, hey, hey. I want some funky grace, yay, hey. You see, I changed it when I'm working with kids. Yeah, because it was written for kids. Yeah.
Oh, okay. What were the circumstances of that one?
I was teaching when I came home after 16 years on the road. 1985, I returned to East St. Louis. I was hired by my dear friend and the one with whom I helped found the East St. Louis Monitor in 1963. I was a student here at SIUE, and he approached me. So we were dear friends, and he was a lover of the arts and a promoter of the arts, supporter of the arts. He hired me as special assistant to the superintendent for cultural and language arts. And what I had was an open field. You know, there were 37 schools at the time. There are now fewer than, there are 20-some schools now. There were 37 schools. I had the principals and the teachers in my arms, you know, to do virtually what I wanted, you know, with the blessings of the superintendent and especially the deputy superintendent, who was a woman English teacher, you know, Dr. Parks, who entered high school as a teacher the year I graduated. So we went way back. And this man, Clyde Jordan, got me hired. He was president of the school board. I think the most powerful black politician in the history of the community, because he was president of the school board, publisher, founder of the East St. Louis Monitor, president of the Democratic Precinct Committeemen's Organization, which means he controlled the political machine, and supervisor of the township, which dispensed you know, goodies and, you know, winning the gap between people who might get put out of the house or might not have food and staying in the houses and having food. So the township did that, helped, you know, help people. Anyway, I came home and I went to see him and he said, write what you would do and bring it to me. Tell me what you would do. In other words, what kind of a point was, how would you do it? So I became special assistant to the superintendent for culture and language arts and poet in residence in the school district. Well, I was already a poet in residence for the city. And I went to work with my crew. I hired Sherman Fowler. I hired Lori Reed. You met her, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I started politicizing the teachers. You know, 3 teachers took my course. 5 years later, 3 of the teachers took my course teaching African American oral and written literature. Alessandria, Redina Medley, and Edna Farmer came here and taught it in the summer. You know. So what I did was I circuit rode the schools. I had special programs. I brought in Warren and Hudlin. I brought in Quincy. You know, we wrote a proposal. The Illinois Arts Council gave us like $7,000 to bring poets. And we brought in people like Quincy played basketball with the kids because he was a basketball star at Grambling. So he played basketball and read poetry. I mean, that was really hip. We had Sterling Plump in the school, we had Shirley LaFleur. The Writers Club was born a year later in '86, so we got going with Alima Sandra Reynolds. She's the wife of the saxophone player, the legendary saxophone player from here. So that's the kind of thing we were doing. We had summer arts festivals. We showed movies in the schools. Really rubbed it up in the summer. I circuit rode. I did teacher training programs. I mean, it was really, really rich. I think by the time I finished 3 years later, we had about 12 of the principals and about 75 teachers out of several hundred that were at a very advanced stage of readiness, you know, dealing with culture. You know, they could deal with black culture, and allied cultures, and allied forms of poetry and allied forms of expression. And of course, some retired. You know, when I left, nobody stepped into the spot because it had been the first only. You know, the first time and the only time. Nobody's had that position since. That's when I came to SIU again. One of the schools that I worked with was Lucas School in the South End, Martin Van Lucas. And it was a black man who, early in the 20th century, was like an administrator for like 6 schools, before they had, before we got a black superintendent, they had like administrators for clusters of schools. And this guy had been an administrator like for 6 schools. So they named his elementary school after him. And a friend of mine, Dr. Edna Allen, was the director of Gifted for the district. So Dr. Allen and Mrs. Starks, who was principal out there, and I got together, and we did special programs through that elementary school. And one of the assignments I gave the students was, it was a two-part assignment. Use rhythms from games. Number them. Number the times that you repeat, or you or dumpty dump, right? Play with that, put that down. And I taught them the oxymoron. We had several weeks of exercises where they learned, and so they were to do the oxymoron and use rhythms from some game or some situation that they encountered at school, playground, at a pajama party, in the kitchen, with the mother, with the fathers, out moving about, whatever, but take it out of the culture, And this was my contribution, funky grace, right? And we even talked about how funky was, how for them, funky didn't mean nasty, But in my generation of youth, it was like using a bad word. So you couldn't say funky. You meant somebody smelled bad.
Yeah.
If you said it when I was a kid. If you said that about some person, you'd get a whipping for that, a reprimanded. And now, there was P-Funk, everybody bring on the funk and that kind of thing. So that's how, this was my contribution to that. And
what year was that?
That was 1985,
85,
86.
Okay,
Yeah,
85.
yeah, I worked from 85 to 88.
Okay.
I had that position.
Okay.
So this is what, and then I coupled it with, for me, my friend who had died in 1981, my best friend Joseph Harrison, who had my back in the 60s and the 70s.
You said the Hero series. You were going to do a series of these?
Yeah. And I still plan to do it. I have some poems that are for men and women who, for me, are heroes. But I was going to do it consciously. Now I'm doing it so that the way poets generally work is like you just write a poem here and there, and then you collect it into a volume. So I'm writing poems about certain people, and then I will put them in the Hero series instead of writing like I did for the book Songs from an Afrophone and in the time of Writing Desire, where the poems are written in a sequence, knowing they were going to be about music and song, black culture, and about love, various kinds of love.
So this is one you certainly wrote knowing that you were going to be performing it.
Oh yeah, of course. It was written to be performed. Yeah. And I have used drummers, I've used dancers, I've used voice choruses. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I've seen when you do the call and response with the audience saying that A part. Yeah. And so the young folks, I'm sure they like this one. What was the response like?
Oh, it was fantastic. And everywhere I go, I mean, sometimes you have to tell them to tone it, hey, because you want to hear what I'm saying and you want to get into the rhythm, this is a follow-up to poems and other experiments, practices that were part of my early life, my life as a kid, and then when I went to Southern University to teach and stage work down there. Yeah, you find that that's where I use that drum voices, the word drum voices on the sand, drum voices on the soil, on the sands of time, footsteps pounding. I gotta remember it, but it is a coming forth. The night within us coming forth. The drum voice is coming forth. The village center. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's one that, it seems it's had a life of its own on there.
Yeah.
Because of that. That's interesting.
I was thinking, I think all of the time about Larry Neal and his comment about poems being scripts. When you write them down, they're not supposed to be static. It's something that we all knew, from the way you saw what I did at the end of this poem, and I do that with a lot. I said Maya does it.
Yeah.
I see Maya, and I said I know her poetry. that ain't the poem. But then It's he says it's script. It's just an outline. When you get up there, take it. Yeah. Like me, the way I repeat at the end of that Miles poem. The death is a cool, y'all. And then I break into my Miles stance. The death is a cool, y'all. After I say it twice and then I do that, Came birth of an ancestor.
So it seems like over the years, into the idea of audiences has sort of impacted how you even approach pieces. Like, because you can almost predict, and particularly when it's on music, it seems like that around a Miles Davis audience, they know all of those references.
They know, of course.
Yeah. So.
And I think that I'm going to do a book of performance pieces. I mean, if Nikki Giovanni can get away with, poetry. Yeah. And I love Nikki. But if Nikki Giovanni can, and I mean, she's consistent. She ain't gonna change. It's narratives. Yeah. And I think that Soulo Beauty stepped into the gap with his latest title, Liberation Narratives. I think things are kind of like, I think he had some brilliant work. But I think he's seeing, I think he's always seen that his poetry is different from mainstream and from black classical poetry. And I think Liberation Narratives as a title, as a handle, demonstrates his recognition of that. Liberation Narratives. You're not going to see that on another book of poetry. Narrative. That's true. You're not going to see that. I think he's come to grips with what he's doing, and he can stretch out. He's done it anyway, but
you mentioned that before too. Like, I mean, it's a break, and I've been thinking a lot about it. All of those poets who were born in the 30s, versus those born after, like. And because I was looking, thanks to the Quincy Troop book, like I'm looking at him writing about the musicians as well. Which he's been doing for years. But in that most recent one, he's still. But a lot of the musicians you all write about who are very kind of influential were born in the 20s. So it's almost like people look. I mean, older brothers. Almost like you've seen Miles, an older brother or a young uncle. So I was just thinking about that, how that might help explain something about that age and who you look to a little bit older.
And I think that everybody says, everybody who talks about jazz in a formal way, they say, okay, this is your intellectual music. And at Miles' funeral, Moore, East St. Louis, when I stood up, the first thing I said was, I remember it, and they got a tape, I didn't get the video. the first thing I said was, first thing that came out of my mouth was, the first time I saw and heard the word intellectual and decided I wanted to be one. And then you had this roar out there, subs, and a bunch of people just laughed. You know, the whole idea of opening up like that was when I was reading liner notes with some older jazz heads, and I saw it there.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
I was 13, I said. and I thought, like the word, you know, like what James William Johnson called the ear-filling, mouth-filling, intellectual, you know, words. And then I went on to, you know, so I think that's very natural, because you look at stuff like Denmark Vesey. Not Denmark Vesey, you know, Paul Vesey.
Oh, yeah.
Paul Vesey, Alan. I mean, all these poems that are out there about birds and, you know, fingering bird's skull. It's one poet. I think it's the Jewish black poet, where he's like Yorick and Hamlet fingering the skull.
Oh, yeah.
So he's fingering Yardbird's skull. You know, I mean, that's some heavy stuff, man. Shakespeare and Charlie Parker. I mean, it's a very, very, very apt and very traditional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I said, but at the same time, I taught at the University of Michigan at a Robert Hayden conference after he died.
Yeah.
And Florida, one thing I said to Florida, Michael Harper came up and said, why? I said, Hayden dealt with blues, not jazz. And I left it like that. And he said, why? He said, why? I said, because jazz is a hybrid. You know, I mean, it's brilliant, but it's a hybrid. And Hayden, whom some people derided for being too sissified and, you know, academic, was authentic. That's interesting. Homage to Queen of the Blues.
Yeah.
He didn't deal with it. He dealt with the blues. And really ironic, because you think like, well, in fact, somebody was telling me that the philosopher of the Renaissance, you know, from Howard.
Oh, Alan Locke.
Yeah, somebody would say that. Somebody told me that he was listening to classical music on it. You know, on the side he was very kind of T to T. So, but he was, you know, he was the exponent, the purveyor and conveyor of the mind of the Harlem black culture, right? Yeah. But anyway, the point is that I made that statement after I finished off off stage. The poets came up to me and asked me why. And then I took black ivory, black gold, black silver, that lining, you know, in middle passage.
Yeah.
And I said, you know, one gin, one bourbon, and one beer. Now, the song, then I said, black gold, black ivory, black tear. I can't think of that.
Yeah.
I did that on the stage. So they said, man, how did you get that? I said, that's what he was doing. That's what Hayden was doing. And they all, we went to lunch, man. They were saying, well, where did you get the idea? And I said, this is basic, man. You know, jazz is intellectual music, of course.
Yeah.
Hayden was our intellectual, right? But he went to the root of the culture. For all of what people say about him,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
homage to the Queen of the Blues. Yeah. So I'm just saying that there are all kinds of ironies running through it.
Yeah.
He knew jazz was a hybrid music. You know, he knew that everybody who wrote on the back of these liner notes said, well, you know, they paid homage to the people who had done a little study in Europe. You know, you had to write, genuflected to Europe first before they started assessing the black jazz musician or the white jazz musician. That is until Baraka, A.B. Spellman, and people like that. I was talking about that at a lecture out east the other day. Until these young guys came, you know, until these young black critics came. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for talking with me about your poetry, Dr. Redmond. The first poem that I was hoping we could talk about is The Eye in the Ceiling, which you won first prize at Washington University's Festival of the Arts in 1965 for this poem. While you were a graduate student there, from 64 to 66. And then actually all of the poems that I'm gonna talk with you about are from your book, The Eye in the Ceiling, which won the American Book Award in 1993.
Right.
So, without further ado, would you mind reading The Eye in the Ceiling for us?
Yes, I wouldn't mind at all. I have one question. Yes. Did I tell you I won the award, or did you find it? You found it?
I think I found that in different sources, you know, about you.
Okay. Well, that's impressive. You're really quite a detective. I've been noticing this for some time, that you found a lot of things that I either had forgotten or in some instances didn't even know about, and of course I remember that I found the newspaper, the WashU newspaper, and the St. Louis Globe Democrat paper, with a photo of me receiving the award. Yeah, and the Globe Democrat doesn't exist. Had you ever heard of that paper?
Yes, I have heard of that paper.
Doesn't exist anymore.
I'll have to look for that photo.
Yeah, I have it. I mean, it's in the archive. We just sent, by the way, 42 boxes up last week. Did you know that?
I had heard a rumor to that effect.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, Letty Herber and Steve Hansen and facilities manager worked out, you know. I met them at 8 o'clock. Well, closer to 9 when they got there, Thursday morning. So I told the crew, I said, you know, sometimes it looks like we're never going to end. I said, but we will if I live long enough, you know. It's because it is shrinking, you know, the room is shrinking, except that I got all the stuff at the house and some stuff in the storage that I have to go through, you know, a lot of stuff that I don't, you know, I'm not ready to let go yet because I'm working on it, and I'm doing a book with the Urban Institute for Urban Research, and I'm also trying to do some autobiographical stuff, you know, but I don't know. And of course you're doing something.
And I'm working on a project as well.
Yeah, wonderful. The Eye in the Ceiling, for Gerald E. Thomas and Donald L. Finkel. You sit snug in my ceiling, staring at the room, while insects worship you. But I can hide you in the night, and your body, like a corpse, loses its heat in seconds. This time, however, resurrection is simple, far simpler than the painful mathematics of your birth. Though in your final death, I'll go through the clumsy ritual of unwinding you, knowing I could not have touched you in your citadel an hour ago.
So obviously it's about a light bulb and a ceiling light.
Yes.
It's very, very clever. Did you have another metaphor going on that you were suggesting there, or is it
Of
Is
course.
the poem what it seems? Or
Of
is there
course,
more?
several.
Okay. Well, would you tell us about that?
Sure. You know the saying, the aphorism, moray, warning, don't be like an ostrich walking with his head up, it'll get cut off, you know, or a chicken running around with it. You know that. Yeah. The high and the mighty, you know, we all die, no matter how rich, how poor, how beautiful, how black, white, green, red. You know, the pompous, the humble, the shy. We all hit bottom. We come down, you know. And that's probably the broad metaphor, you know, the analogy. Yeah. I was thinking about experiences. I was actually thinking about some of the experiences I had at WashU, which is, I was doing my tenure there that I wrote it. And some of the difficulties, you know, that was one of the peaks in civil rights, early mid-60s. And writing poems and having someone say around, you know, having a teacher say, not right after I read a poem, some of the poems are more attached to my own upbringing and the culture. Although this one is very, very profoundly attached to my upbringing, you know. Because if the insects got in to worship the bulb, then you might get a whipping for leaving the screen door open, or leaving open a door that didn't have a screen, or a window, leaving up a window that didn't have a screen, because that meant everybody was miserable that night, because the mosquitoes ate us all. They made meals of us, right? So who left that door open? Who left that screen up? Who didn't put the screen in when they let up when they would pull the window up? You know, so that's right. So that was just very linked to my personal experience, watching the insects move around street lamps and yeah. But yeah, I had experiences at Washington U that some were not the best. You know, I would be followed to my car by security, and once a week, or depending on who was working, they would want to know what a black man was doing on the campus. I even went to the file a complaint, you know, because there were only 9 black students over there at the time, you know. So it was part of that, and a teacher who would say, after I read a poem to be critiqued, you know, on this oval table, maybe 2 poems later, you know, read by other students, he would say, there are certain subjects that are inappropriate for poetry. They don't belong in the realm of poetry. And, you know, and I would say, you know, he's talking about my mama, you know, because the poem I had read earlier, you know. So that kind of experience too, you know, somebody up there, he was one of the eyes in the ceiling for me, you know.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Yeah, so those are some of them. Gerald Eugene Thomas was my roommate and my dear friend. We had gone to SIU together. And Donald Finkel was my revered mentor. He was an open-minded, very patient man.
I like the rhythm of this poem and the your use of multi-syllable words like resurrection and mathematics and ritual. I mean, all as like first words of lines, that three-syllable words. I don't know. It seems to sort of create like a rhythm inside the poem for me when I hear it. I like that a lot. And I also like how you use you're having a conversation with the light bulb, sort of. It's like you say I and you back and forth. You know, it sort of makes this symmetry. I don't know.
Yeah.
I really enjoy the poem a lot. I think it's very artistic.
Well, this is it's very interesting to hear you say that, and thinking of the work you're doing, an occasional poem and comment might spice it, like.
To include something like
Yeah,
that in the...
and your comment, because I think this poem was written around the time a number of those books, like the woman, To Mix with Time, the woman.
Yes, May Swenson.
May Swenson. Yeah, I mean, it was there that I was at Wash U that I bought that book, and a lot of, so that's.
So maybe some influences there.
Yeah. Just listening to you, I did read the judge's report, and one statement said, now I've changed it slightly here, like this time, however, I put that in instead of resurrection is simple. That was how that stanza began. Resurrection is simple. One judge said, no, if one word were taken out or one word were added, it would destroy the poem. His assessment of what he felt was perfect,
Yeah,
that really moved me too,
That's a wonderful compliment.
I know it as a student, to have a famous, well-known person, poet, say that, Wow.
Well, shall we move on to Highflown Love?
Sure.
On page 158.
158?
Yes.
58 or 68?
58.
58, okay. Yeah.
So I think I mentioned to you that I saw a video on a computer of you discussing this poem.
Yeah.
And I looked back before I came here, and it was actually...
was it Miami?
It was at Miami-Dade College in 2007.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you said something like, and I'm going to paraphrase here, that you said the poem is sort of about the difference between how people in disadvantaged or disenfranchised communities, for one reason or another, maybe for gender or race or religion, how the people inside those communities are seen by the people outside who maybe aren't so empathetic to them.
Sure.
And then also in the poem, then I guess it switches the perspective, and it's also about how the people inside the community see themselves.
Yes.
So
let me just say, as we're leaving the eye in the ceiling, that one of my students, years later, after this poem was written and had won the award, one of my students in the Experiment in Higher Education in East St. Louis, SIU, East St. Louis, brought me a photo one day of a light in the ceiling, but it was it was shaded. It had a globe on it, and he happened to be a student who smoked reefer a lot. I could tell, he was grown. He had been in service like I had, so he was a grown person and younger than me, but adult, you know. He'd been in Vietnam. And he was a very brilliant guy, who's dead now. But he brought me this photo, and I asked him what was it? And he said, well, the eye in the ceiling, because I didn't connect it. And I wasn't sure he even knew about it. Maybe he'd heard me read it or something. And I thought that was quite an honor, you know. And he shot this photo, and I guess he had been lying on the floor, and you know. But it was a globe, and I wondered why it was a globe and not a bare bulb, you know. I still have the picture. Highflown love from the eye in the ceiling. In the high-flown language of moon travelers, social scientists sought our hurts, add their small crippled vision, and rearrange our private pains along the Wall Street of current demands. And my people become the cocaine that makes America high, become dreams America sucks through maniacal straws of sleep. Discounting our law, the scientists say we cannot love, say our needs are numbed. But sometimes when you construct knots in my throat and your lips recreate my heart clock, I am hypnotized by the aggregate passion of my past, by the sum of my historical ecstasy, a power we know cannot be stilled by airborne theories of scholars nestled in Freudian citadels, a power that cannot be seen, heard, or flattened to fit the pages of a book. Wow. Yeah, that takes me places when I read that. You know, the hurt, the joy, you know, the what I put into thinking about the poem before I wrote it, you know. And as I was writing it, wow, yeah, it really, you know, what I was reading, what I was teaching, you know, what my colleagues who were closer to this, the social scientists, were teaching and how they were trying to work with it in the classroom. Some colleagues, and other colleagues were aiding and abetting this negative feeling, you know. Yeah, I remember I remember a colleague saying to me, he had a daughter who got pregnant once and then got pregnant again. And she was telling me about it. I had known the daughter when the daughter was a girl, you know. And this woman had worked hard, European American. She had worked very hard to get to where she was. And I had taught her. She had had the ethnic courses, you know, Black Lit, and, you know, the degrees in English. She was now a colleague, not at my school, but at a community college, but a colleague. And so she and her daughter weren't speaking. And I went to visit her one day, and she said she's had another child. And I said, oh, well, I'm sorry, I'm glad you have another granddaughter, but I'm sorry, you know, she did. And she said, you know, that's something you don't normally associate with black. And then she caught herself. This is a student who had studied with me, studied this kind of problem. But it's just that, you know, she'd come out of that. And she just threw a, you know, she said, I need some mouthwash. I need some, you know, yeah. But it was, And I just said, well, you need to take another look at the statistics, and you'll see. Just read the statistics. Yeah. Anyway, it was. And you know, we struggle, as I always said in my classes, I say now, like, you know, you just have to practice mental hygiene every day. Well, everyone does. You got to practice mental hygiene, cultural hygiene, sexual attitude hygiene, artistic hygiene. You know, we have to get up and practice it every day. Just work on ourselves. You know, with a slip. You know, yeah, all of us. We all. You know. So that and this poem provoked questions. I don't know if it's there. It might have been during the Q&A. It might have been later. There were a lot of questions because the audience. Do you see the audience at all? See, the audience, I was in Miami, Florida. So the audience was Haitian, Cuban, other East hemispheric Latinos or Hispanics, Black Americans, European, Anglo-American. But it was heavy with Hispanics. And boy, those students and those professors, they really went into this, you know. Yeah, especially after I made that statement and then read the poem. Yeah, Highflown love. It's sort of like the same with Eye in the Ceiling. That's interesting because it seems like this is a theme running through my work. The Eye in the Ceiling, where that person up there looking down. You know the saying, be kind to the people on your way up because you might meet them on the way down.
Right.
But it's the same, yeah.
Moon travelers, small crippled vision. Yeah, definitely a little out of touch in the stratosphere there. I was wondering that at the beginning of the second half, the part where it says, when you construct knots in my throat and your lips recreate my heart block. Are you talking about romantic love there to contrast with this statement right before that, the scientists say we cannot love?
Yeah. That and romantic love and statements, because we're statements that constrict. You know, because it's a bigger picture. It's not just that. Miles Davis used to talk about this, and a number of black icons used to say, why aren't there more real romantic scenes and among blacks in movies? Why don't black people make love? You either get somebody fornicating, you know, in a negative portrayal, or they just don't get to that part, you know. So there's more to it than simply loving, but, you know, loving, you know, being intimate, you know, as lovers. That's the whole intimacy of conversation, of pride, respect, you know, and that's what I was trying to get to also. Just hearing, I was talking to Howard earlier about this, the pedagogy of that we used, or that undergirded the development of the new curricula, and that's something I'm most proud of. Because this stuff like this, this just collapses, you know, hundreds of books and articles that I read to go in and make an intelligent statement, or give an intelligent lecture, or lead an intelligent discussion. Where do you start to talk about people? How do you talk? I mean, when the students said Black Studies, then, you know, the mouths of a lot of us did this. You know, what do I teach? You know, I've been mastering white studies or Euro-Anglo studies. Though some people might not think of it that way. So then you've got to overnight, you know, talk about how on occasion, I'd come into a classroom bloodshot because I just finished the novel we were going to discuss. What was I going to read? The Black Canon. What was I going to read? All of Baldwin, all of Zora Neale Hurston, you know, all of Ralph Ellison, excuse me, all of John Oliver Killens, all of Chester Himes, you know. Even Toni Morrison, what she had done at the time that we started. Paul Marshall, the West Indian woman writer. Where was I going to find the time to read all that? So it was right up on us, you know. So speaking intelligently about the world, trying to put something together in an art form so that, you know, the two halves here, you know, can make sense to people, you know, anybody who reads it, without even mentioning a color here. And I think that's one of the things that got the students in Miami, that know my people, because the same kind of attitude is held about, quote, rednecks, country people. You know, they don't really have it like we have it, you know, some people do. In fact, I remember doing some studies of the skewing of culture in this Middle Atlantic, the Columbia School of Broadcasting. You know about that? Yeah, for the decades that occurred before TV and radio would have a major, respectable announcer or an anchor with a Southern accent. You know, it was that no language or meta language. It comes somewhere between U.S. and England in the ocean, and nobody actually talks like that at Columbia School of Broadcasting, right? So you have that filters down to behavior and, you know, what you eat and, you know, so on and so forth. People look down, you know. So we're constantly trying to work that, you know.
Well, I just I loved this poem the first time I read it. It's probably one of my favorites, even though I didn't understand everything you were trying to say. There was just something so powerful about that second half. I just really enjoyed that. I like the part you know, the ending, you know, power that cannot be seen, heard, or flattened to fit the pages of a book, sort of, you know, transcendent kind of thing.
And so even here, you can't do it. Fit the page of.
Well, and it makes me think about, you know, the work that I'm working on about your library and, you know, your biography, and I take that as sort of a warning to myself, you know, that there's only so much I can do.
Yeah. In working in writers' workshops, I always say, and then when I'm just introducing writers, in fact, one thing they want me to do in each of the assemblies that I'll be conducting on Wednesday, the teacher, the master teacher that is arranging it, she said that I'd like for them to know something, you know, about you as a writer. When did you start writing, and so on, you read in between, you know, as you read, and what it takes to be a writer, you know, because they want to focus on writing, which I'm very happy, because much of the time it's on culture and the word is entertainment. And I'm very happy that they literally want to focus on me as a writer. They really want me from the lowest grade up to the top. They want to make sure that the students understand what a writer does, or what it means to be a writer. So I thought, wow, that's, because you rarely get a public school teacher. This is like the first through 8th grade. Oh no, wait, no, I'm sorry, not. It's 4 through 8, I think, 5 through 8. You rarely get people saying that. I mean, she pinpointed that's what she wanted. She would like for me to be sure to include. So, and I say to audiences that that the job of the writer is to take the casket, the heart attack, the gunshot, the kiss, the wedding, the auto race, and put it here so that you really see that. You see the Indy 500, even though you know it's not here. And that is master work. You never stop working to get to that point. And I have the funnel. I draw a funnel that has the blunderbuss mouth on each end. Okay, you take the farmer and his life and his wife and children, and them sending the kids off to college. You enter this one open end of the funnel with all of that. That's the writer now. When the writer travels through that narrow neck. And then at the other end, it's a two-headed funnel, a two-mouth funnel. At the other end, it has to be what you actually saw, but it's in the book. So then it explodes on the page. So that farmer who enters this, physically comes out on a page, of whatever the experience. Yeah.
Another thing I really liked about this poem is just the way it's crafted with the sounds. The way you play with the sounds of the words. Like just on almost any line, there's the consonants and the assonants. I think it is. Where you're echoing the sounds of the consonants and vowels.
Yes.
Like I guess especially the historical ecstasy, that sort of whispery sound that is repeated and then nestled, citadels, it's just really ties, it's tight in a way, it's again like the eye on the ceiling, you can't really take any words away from it, it's all, it's all constructed as this, work of art.
Well, it's a number of writers said it. Hemingway, a whole bunch of writers said, "Easy reading is damn hard writing." Yeah.
I like that quote. Well, shall we move on to Sonnet Serenade, Soulo Beauty on page 94?
Sonnet Serenade, Soulo Beauty. And there's one of my inventions, the solo, for Gwendolyn Brooks. Behold the forms and rhythms of my face, coral trees and solos limbly bowing, green hiss, grass low, and mournful in spark space, caught crying, caroling, and no howling. Sometimes in gusty soul soliloquies, within vast valleys and mountainous songs, or much iterated with ahs and me's, short-circuited or shattered against gongs. A Lord-length voice invades these jungle sparks, neoning, drum scripting a passion rain, which seeds tear tunes, and in the drum path marks a cool, mellow maid of song, and a main squeeze, close held, in sound arms, in hip song rap, whose love, buttoned in gold, is your lyre lap. Yeah, I saw a couple of typos in this one. Ooh, siren, I don't know why we, and these jungle spots would be jungle.
Oh.
Anyway, hockey, wow. Hockey, the Third World Press is going to, well, that's the plan, bring out a 50-year retrospective of my poetry, 1962 to 2012, for my 75th birthday in December. We're supposed to get that. Got to have it into the manuscript by early June, early July at the latest, as he said.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so yeah, we'll catch some of these things. Sighing instead of crying. Okay. Anyway.
So this one was for Gwendolyn Brooks, and
Yes.
I wondered if you chose the sonnet form and sort of the style of the like hyphenated words and things to sort of as a tribute to some of the devices she uses sometimes in her poems, not always.
Not
right?
always, yes.
But she uses the sonnet form.
She does,
sometimes.
yeah.
So that was intentional
Yes, yes.
as a tribute.
Yes, and her work is extremely compressed. We say economic in in our classes, in workshops. Economy. She practices economy and the use of words, and I wanted to capture that as well as her, well, philosophically, how she sees her thrust in the world, concise, inventive within that conciseness, musical within that inventive conciseness, and philosophical within that inventive, concise musicality.
Very complex.
Cultural within that inventive, concise, philosophical musicality.
I was reading.
Wow. I didn't even know I could remember that stream. My memory is not like, it's nowhere near what it was. But I do practice like what I just did. I practice because I noticed that I told Howard that I was going to give him some names of people that I couldn't come up with, and one is Fela Sowande, a philosopher, African philosopher, and I quoted a couple of times. I owe so much to him. So it's coming to me now. I'll have to tell him. Yeah.
Well, I read a little bit about what you wrote about Gwendolyn Brooks in Drum Voices, the Mission of Afro-American Poetry, Critical History, and you said that sculpture, precision, explicitness, and terseness are key words to remember when approaching Gwendolyn Brooks' poetry. So I think that is also kind of describes his poem, too, his poem. And you do say that, I think in your discussion of her in Drum Voices, that she's not an easy read poet.
Yeah. And this may not be the easiest read, although I think it's accessible.
I think it's a little challenging to the amateur like myself, but it's enjoyable.
Fascinating too, the sonnet, the nature of the sonnet. You know, there are various kinds of sonnets. And the one that I was modeling this piece after is a problem-solving sonnet.
Would you explain that? I don't
Well, you
know.
introduce a problem or an issue in the first 8 lines. And then in the second, they call the sestet, octet, excuse me. And then in the sestet, the second section, 6th line, you answer it or reaffirm it. So you got all this stuff going on called crying, caroling, and no howling. And then a Lord length voice invades these jungle sparks. Yeah. You end up, and she's the mellow maid. The cool, mellow maid of song. In other words, she comes into the forest, my forest. And I'm indebted to another poet for some of the thinking, E.E. Cummings, because he has a line, a great love poetry. Lady, through whose profound and fragile lips the sweet, small, clumsy feet of April came into the ragged meadow of my soul. I used to quote that when I was a freshman here. Oh, my, well, East St. Louis. This building didn't exist initially. But such a, so the ragged meadow, you see, tiptoeing into the lips to the door, and
I like how
come out to, the words that come out, her mouth, whatever else comes out of her mouth.
I like how the third to last line, main squeeze, wraps the line so that the rhythm is kind of changed a little bit. Every other line ends, pauses at the end of the line, and then right before the end, you do that rap. That shakes it up a little bit, and it makes you sit up to attention or something. I think that was really good.
And this you use the word rap, because sometimes I use the word rap in my poems, and I have W/RAP. It's like in movie lingo, it's a rap, we're finished. And I wanted that because I wanted I wanted the rap. See, this is rap. I'm getting a main squeeze. That's not informal poetry.
Right. Yeah.
So I wanted to, bring it to earth,
And then you just explicitly say hip song rap.
Yeah, right.
To bring the point home. Yeah, there's a lot going on.
Lyre laugh, and wow. You have notes on some of these.
Well, I think with my pen,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certain things that I like soul soliloquies. That word.
Yeah, I like that too. It's musical.
Yeah, I wanted, and I combine a few words here: vast valleys and green hiss, grass low. I wanted that. Yeah. Neoning and drum scripting. I wanted to get that over there.
Well, shall we go ahead and move to Rivers of Bones and Flesh and Blood?
Yeah.
Page 37.
That's right, yeah. Okay, is this the one that I changed? Oh, yeah, yeah.
This is one that you did on your Buildings and Sacred Places too.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
Sunday
this is,
boarding.
it's been changed some here a little bit. I had, for a little Armstrong, I had Miles Davis and Clark Terry, I think, yeah. River of bones and flesh and blood, Mississippi, for Doris Kaysen. River of time, vibrant vein, bent, crooked, older than the red man who named you, ancient as the wind that break on your serene and shining face. One time, western boundary of America, from whose center your broad shoulders now reach to touch sisters on the flanks. River of truth, mornings you leap, yawn 2,000 miles and shed a giant, joyous tear over sprouting, straggling hives of humanity. Nights you weep as the moon tiptoeing across your silent, silky face hears you praying over the broken backs of black slaves who rode crouched and huddled at your heart in the bellies of steamships. River of memory, laboratory for Civil War boat builders who left huge eyes of steel staring from your sullen depths. Reluctant partner to crimes of Ku Klux Klansmen, the river moved to waves of ecstasy by the venerable trumpet of Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, and Clark Terry. River of bones and flesh, bones and flesh and blood, the nation's largest intestine and longest conveyor belt. River of Mississippi, river of little rivers, river of rises, sometimes subdued by a roof of ice, descending finally on your southward course to spit into the Gulf and join the wrath of other bodies.
Nicely done.
I want to say that Catherine Dunham, under her supervision, the poem was choreographed. That's why you see me moving, all the movements. A French dancer named Christiane de Rougemont choreographed it using some of her own knowledge and Dunham. And it was performed for actually a couple of years, as part of Dunham's traveling, company offering.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Miss Dunham really loved it.
Well, the Mississippi is such a huge, dominating part of the landscape here locally. East St. Louis, Edwardsville, and that's, it's just begging for poetry to be written about it. I'll tell you what I was thinking when I read it. I mean, just one person said. I thought in the first one, the river is sort of like a body part. It's sort of organic. It's part of the landscape. And then in the second stanza, it's becoming more active. It's leaping and weeping and praying and sort of personified. And then in the third stanza, it's almost passive. It's a laboratory, a reluctant partner. You know, it's.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course the next part with the river of bones and flesh and blood, sort of is creating a climax.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And then it finishes with the river as a metaphor, an intestine, a conveyor belt, and something that's dominating but also subdued. And it's, I don't know, I don't really have a clear, you know, thought about it, but that's just the impressions I had when I was reading it.
Yeah, that's basically what I was doing. I was sort of a story of the river from both the river's point of view and a social point of view, historical point of view. From the naming of it, the father watered by native people, and you know. The poem was commissioned by this woman who was a teacher. She was a teacher in the district. Later became director of art for the district.
So Doris Case.
Mm-hmm. She's still alive, and she's a very dear friend, and our families are quite close. And she said, "Why don't you write a poem about the Mississippi?" I read lots of poems. She said, "But write one that humanizes it, gives it more humanistic quality, maybe, you know, and locks it to the culture, you know, places it, you know, culturally contextualizes it." So I went to work. This was like, I think 15 drafts of it. Yeah.
So have you performed that poem several times over the years?
Hundreds of times, possibly thousands.
Wow.
Yeah. I read a letter that a man wrote, a scholar wrote, endorsing my bid for some kind of, you know, grant, and he said that he had some nice things to say about this poem. And he mentioned some other poets of note and said it reminded him of their work. So I was very pleased with that.
I liked in the second stanza the scene move. It's the scene moves, which gives you the feeling of the river moving, where it starts. Nights you weep as the moon tiptoeing across your silent silky face hears you praying over the broken backs of black slaves who rode, crouched and huddled. So, you know, you have the scene of the moon, and then all of a sudden you have the scene of the slaves. You know what I'm saying? It, like this scene is continuous, but all of a sudden you're in this different place.
Yeah.
And you know, which is sort of like what a river does. You know, it moves you from one place to another. And it reminded me actually of, and I'm not sure which book it was, a Toni Morrison book that did the same thing in her novel. Where she was writing about a scene and then it turned into another scene.
I know, a Beloved is like that. That's the one that a lot of people had trouble with. In fact, I was telling my sister that I said, get past page 35 or 40 and you'll be able to, because she said, I don't know what's going on in this book, you know. And, but yeah, Toni does that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, it's something to do with magical realism and something to do with a dramatic, a perception of writing as a dramatic event or as drama, you know. Yeah. Now it comes together, but it's problematic sometimes, you know.
I think it works in your poem. I think it works
in
your poem.
I hope so. Yeah.
Well, those were all the